Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Elsie Paroubek disappearance. It is a Saturday morning in April 1911 in the city of Chicago. The air is heavy with the scent of coal smoke from the nearby factories and the damp, earthy smell of a spring that is only just beginning to wake. The streets are paved with weathered cobblestones, humming with the sound of iron-rimmed wheels and the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves. In the working-class neighborhood of South Lawndale, the houses are built close together, standing like silent witnesses to the lives of thousands of immigrants who have come to this land seeking a new beginning. Among them are the Paroubeks, a family from Bohemia, living in a modest two-story home on South Albany Avenue. Inside the home at 2320 South Albany Avenue, the morning routine is unfolding with a familiar, gentle pace. Frank Paroubek, a painter by trade, has already set out for his day, leaving his wife Carolina to care for their children. The house is a place of modest comfort, filled with the sounds of a busy household and the soft, melodic tones of the Czech language. Carolina moves through the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet. It is the 8th of April, a day that begins with no hint of the tragedy that will soon unfold. The sunlight filters through the windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a hazy, golden glow within the rooms. It is a morning of simple tasks and quiet moments, a snapshot of a time before the world would know her daughter's name. Elsie is only 5 years old, a child of striking beauty whose presence often draws the admiring glances of neighbors. She has soft, curly blonde hair that catches the light and deep blue eyes that reflect a world of innocence and curiosity. On this particular morning, she is dressed in a dark red dress, a vibrant splash of color against the more muted tones of the industrial city. Over her legs, she wears sturdy black stockings, and her feet are tucked into black laced shoes, ready for the short journey she is about to take. She is the youngest of 5 siblings, the 7th child born to the family, and she moves through the house with the easy confidence of a well-loved daughter. She approaches her mother, her voice small and clear, announcing her desire to visit her aunt just a few blocks away. Carolina watches as her daughter prepares to leave through the rear door. The destination is the home of Carolina's sister, Julia Trampota, who lives at 2325 South Troy Street. It is a short walk, perhaps only 5 minutes for a child, requiring only a few turns through the familiar streets of their community. In 1911, the neighborhood is considered safe, a place where children play freely and neighbors keep a watchful eye on one another. As Elsie steps out into the cool morning air, the city around her is alive with activity. She turns left onto 23rd Street, her small shoes clicking against the pavement. The world is large to a 5-year-old, the buildings towering high and the alleyways stretching out like mysterious paths, but she knows her way with the instinctive certainty of childhood. As she approaches South Troy Street, the air is suddenly filled with a different sound, the whimsical, mechanical melody of an organ grinder. It is a common sight in the city, a traveling musician who brings a bit of wonder to the gray streets. A group of children has already gathered, drawn to the music like iron filings to a magnet. Among them is Elsie's 9-year-old cousin, Josie. The children are enchanted, watching as the musician turns the crank, the notes swirling through the air and echoing off the brick walls. Elsie joins them for a moment, her blue eyes wide with fascination. The music is hypnotic, a tinkling, rhythmic tune that masks the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood. For a few minutes, time seems to stand still as the children linger near the gate of Mrs. Trampota's house, lost in the performance. Eventually, the organ grinder begins to move, pulling his instrument toward the corner of 23rd Street. The pack of children follows him, eager to hear the music for just a little longer. But Elsie stays behind. She remains near the gate, a small figure in a red dress standing alone as her friends and cousin drift away. It is approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. A neighbor later recalls seeing her standing there, perhaps contemplating the final few steps to her aunt's door. But she never reaches that door. In the quiet interval that follows the fading music, the vibrant red of her dress disappears into the shadows of the Chicago morning. The busy life of the city continues around her, but the path she took next becomes a mystery that will haunt the streets of South Lawndale for a century to come. The music of the organ grinder does not vanish all at once. Instead, it pulls away like a physical weight, dragging its mechanical melody down the cobblestones of 23rd Street until only the faintest, ghostly echoes remain. The children, previously a buzzing swarm of laughter and movement, begin to drift apart. They return to their stoops and their games of marbles, their small shadows lengthening across the dusty Chicago pavement. In the house at 2320 South Albany Avenue, Elsie Paroubek wipes her hands on her apron, the rhythm of the kitchen providing a steady, comforting pulse. She looks toward the back door, the one Elsie used just a short while ago. The air is still, and the neighborhood is thick with the scent of coal smoke and the heavy, metallic tang of the nearby industrial plants. It is a Saturday in early April, 1911, and the city is caught in that fragile golden hour where the light seems to hold its breath before the evening chill truly sets in. Carolina assumes her daughter is safe, nestled in the warmth of her aunt's kitchen just a few hundred yards away. Time moves differently when we are waiting for something that hasn't yet happened. For Carolina, the first hour passes with the routine of a mother of many. She tends to the younger children and prepares for the arrival of her husband, Frank. But as the clock on the wall ticks past 5 o'clock and then toward 6, a subtle shift occurs in the atmosphere of the home. The silence of the house begins to feel heavy, almost tactile. Carolina finds herself standing at the window more often, her eyes scanning the empty sidewalk that stretches toward the corner. She remembers the dark red dress Elsie wore, a vibrant splash of color that should be easy to spot against the gray-brown brick of the tenements. She thinks of the black stockings and the sturdy, black-laced shoes her 5-year-old daughter was so proud of. The distance to the house of her sister, Julia Trampota, is so very short, merely a 5-minute walk, a path the family has traversed countless times. It is a safe neighborhood, a tight-knit community of Czech immigrants where everyone is a pair of watchful eyes. Yet, the sidewalk remains stubbornly, hauntingly empty. By the time the sun begins to dip below the jagged skyline of the west side, Carolina can no longer ignore the cold knot tightening in her chest. She throws a shawl over her shoulders and steps out into the crisp evening air. The walk to South Troy Street is brief, but every step feels weighted with an inexplicable dread. She passes the spot where the organ grinder had played, noticing the way the shadows of the alleyways seem to reach out toward the street. When she reaches the house at 2325 South Troy, she finds her sister, Julia, and her 9-year-old niece, Josie. The greeting is brief, the question even briefer. Is Elsie here? The answer is a quiet, devastating no. Julia explains that while the children had been outside watching the music, Elsie had stayed behind when the others followed the melody further down the block. The realization hits Carolina with the force of a physical blow. The safety of the short distance has been an illusion. The two women stand in the twilight, looking out at the yard where the grass is just beginning to wake from its winter sleep, searching for a flash of red that isn't there. The search begins with the neighbors. It is a quiet escalation, a series of hushed conversations over garden fences and calls from porch to porch. Have you seen her? The girl in the red dress. The community of the Bohemian California district begins to stir. Men in their work clothes and women with tired eyes come out to their gates, their faces illuminated by the flickering yellow glow of the early street lamps. They check the coal sheds and the small, cramped spaces beneath the back porches. They call out her name, Elsie, into the gathering gloom, but the only response is the distant, rhythmic clatter of a passing streetcar. The air grows colder now, the temperature dropping toward 40 degrees as the true night takes hold. The industrial sounds of Chicago, The hiss of steam, the distant whistle of a locomotive, seem louder in the dark, masking the small sounds a child might make. The neighborhood, once so familiar and protective, now feels vast and labyrinthine, filled with 1,000 places where a small girl could simply vanish. At 9 o'clock, Frank Paroubek arrives home. He is a laborer, a painter by trade, and he carries the weariness of a long day's work in his shoulders. He expects the warmth of his family and a quiet meal. Instead, he finds a house filled with shadows and a wife whose face is etched with a terror he has never seen. There is no time for rest. Frank does not even sit down before he is out the door again, his pace hurried, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He goes to the Hinman Street station, part of the Maxwell Street Police District, to report that his daughter is missing. In the dimly lit station, the air smells of old tobacco and wet wool. The officers are polite but initially dismissive. They have seen this before: a child who wandered off, a girl who fell asleep in a friend's attic, a wanderer who will surely turn up when the morning light breaks. They tell Frank to go home, to wait, to hope. They tell him that children often lose their way in the excitement of a Saturday afternoon. But Frank knows his daughter, and as he walks back through the dark streets, the silence of the city feels like a threat. Back at the house on Albany Avenue, the lights remain burning late into the night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windowpane, brings a momentary surge of hope that is immediately extinguished by the stillness that follows. Carolina sits by the door, her hands clutched in her lap, listening for the sound of small footsteps or a soft knock. She thinks of the organ grinder and the man some neighbors mentioned seeing near the corner. She thinks of the construction sites nearby, the deep trenches and piles of sand where a child might stumble. The dread is no longer a knot. It is a cold, suffocating presence that fills the room. Out on the street, the gaslights cast long, distorted shadows that dance across the empty sidewalk, the very place where Elsie was last seen. The first night of the disappearance is the longest of their lives, a slow descent into a nightmare that is only just beginning. As the clocks strike midnight, the realization becomes absolute. Elsie is gone, and the city of Chicago, with all its noise and light, has swallowed her whole. The Hinman Street Police Station in 1911 was a place of heavy shadows and the persistent scent of stale tobacco and wet wool. It stood at the corner of Hinman and Paulina Streets, a fortress of brick and authority in a neighborhood that was rapidly changing. Inside, the air was thick with the rhythmic clatter of typewriters and the low, gravelly murmurs of men who had seen the darker side of Chicago many times before. When Frank Paroubek first stepped across that worn wooden threshold on the night of April 8th, the world outside was already swallowed by a deep, damp darkness. He was a man of modest means, a painter by trade, and the weight of the evening's silence had finally become too much to bear. He approached the high, scarred desk of the sergeant, his hat clutched tightly in his hands, his voice likely trembling as he spoke the name of his youngest daughter. Elsie. She was only 5 years old, a golden-haired girl in a red dress, and she had been gone for 12 hours. In the flickering glow of the gaslights, the sergeant's ledger lay open like a vast, indifferent mouth, waiting to swallow another name into the list of the city's missing. The initial response was not the frantic mobilization one might expect today. In those early years of the 20th century, children often wandered, drifting between the homes of aunts and neighbors in the tight-knit immigrant communities of the West Side. The police, weary from a long shift of handling the city's boisterous nightlife, suggested to Frank that the little girl was likely sleeping soundly at a friend's house, perhaps tucked away in a corner of a parlor just a few blocks away. They told him to go home, to wait for the morning light, assured that the sun would bring her back to Albany Avenue. But as the clock on the station wall ticked toward midnight, the quiet in the Paroubek home remained absolute. By the time the sun rose on April 9th, 1911, the dismissive tone at the precinct had vanished. Captain John Mahoney, A man known for his directness and his deep knowledge of the city's labyrinthine streets, took personal charge of the investigation. The case of the missing girl in the red dress was no longer a simple matter of a wandering child. It was becoming a shadow that loomed over the entire city. Captain Mahoney wasted no time in deploying his men. Detectives from the Maxwell Street station were called in to assist, their heavy boots echoing on the cobblestones as they began a door-to-door canvass that would eventually cover miles of urban terrain. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of patrolmen, dressed in their stiff, dark blue uniforms with silver buttons gleaming under a gray Chicago sky, fanning out across the neighborhood. They moved through the narrow alleyways and climbed the steep back stairs of tenement buildings, knocking on doors that opened to the smells of cabbage soup and floor wax. At every stop, they asked the same questions, their voices becoming a monotonous chant against the backdrop of the city's roar. Have you seen a girl of 5? Golden hair? A red dress and a red hat. The difficulty of the task was immense. This was a city of nearly 2 million people, a sprawling maze of immigrant enclaves where dozens of languages were spoken, and where a small child could be hidden in 1,000 different cellars or attics. The sheer density of the population made every face a potential witness, and every stranger a potential suspect. As the hours stretched into days, the investigation began to coalesce around a few unsettling theories. One of the first leads came from a young boy named John Jarowski, who lived in the neighborhood. He told the detectives at the Maxwell Street station that he had seen a wagon on Kedzie Avenue on the morning of the disappearance. It was a wagon belonging to a group of Romany people, often referred to in the sensationalist papers of the time as gypsies. Inside the wagon, the boy claimed to have seen 2 women holding a fair-skinned little girl who was crying. In the social climate of 1911, this news acted like a spark in a tinderbox. The police and the public alike were quick to lean into old, prejudiced tropes of wandering travelers stealing children. Inspector Stephen Healy ordered a dragnet over the southwestern side of the city, focusing on the encampments along the Des Plaines River. The search became an exercise in cultural friction, as police raided camp after camp, peering into wagons and questioning families who were simply passing through the outskirts of the industrial giant that was Chicago. Every blue-eyed child found in these camps was scrutinized, their heritage questioned by men who were desperate for a resolution. Beyond the suspicion of the wagons, the detectives turned their eyes toward the physical hazards of the landscape. Chicago in 1911 was a city under construction, a place of deep trenches and half-finished bridges. Frank Paroubek himself had mentioned the heavy work being done on the streets near their home. He worried that his daughter might have fallen into a hole near a construction site, buried under shifting sand and gravel while the workers were distracted. Captain Mahoney also looked toward the water. The Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, a massive feat of engineering, cut through the landscape like a dark ribbon of glass. It was a dangerous, deep waterway, and the fear that Elsie had slipped from a bridge or wandered too close to the edge began to weigh heavily on the investigators. By April 12th, only 4 days after she vanished, Inspector Healy ordered that the drainage canals be dragged. Long iron hooks were lowered into the cold, murky depths, pulled along the bottom in a grim search for a body that no one truly wanted to find. The water was silent, offering up only debris and the city's discarded remnants, leaving the detectives with more questions than answers. The precinct house became a clearinghouse for a deluge of tips and false leads. Every time a girl in a red dress was spotted in a passing carriage or seen walking with a stranger in a distant suburb like Western Springs, the telephones at the station would ring incessantly. Detectives were dispatched to hotels, to train stations, and to remote farmhouses, often arriving only to find a different child and a confused family. The pressure on the police was immense, fueled by the daily headlines of the Chicago American and the Daily Tribune, which featured large photographs of Elsie's dimpled face on their front pages. The mystery of her whereabouts was no longer a local tragedy. It had become a national obsession. Inside the Hinman Street station, the map of the city was covered in red pins, each one marking a place where Elsie might have been. Yet the center of the map, the area around South Albany Avenue, remained stubbornly blank. The early 20th century city, with its lack of surveillance cameras and its reliance on the fleeting memories of passers-by, was proving to be a formidable adversary. As the first week drew to a close, the frantic energy of the initial search began to settle into a heavy, grinding determination. The precinct was quiet again, but it was the quiet of a long, arduous watch. Chicago in early April 1911 was a city of shifting shadows and damp, clinging fog. The winter ice had finally begun to surrender to a muddy spring, but the air still held a bite that made the residents of the West Side pull their coats tight. In the neighborhood around South Albany Avenue, the initial worry for 5-year-old Elsie Paroubek had curdled into a thick, suffocating dread. It was no longer just a family's private tragedy. It was becoming a collective fever. The rhythmic clatter of the printing presses at the Chicago Tribune and the inter-ocean acted like a heartbeat for this growing anxiety, pumping sensational headlines into every parlor and tavern. Every narrow alleyway and shadowed doorway now seemed to hide a dark secret, and the city's gaze began to turn away from its own muddy streets toward the distant, flickering campfires on its outskirts. The newspapers of the era, ever hungry for a narrative that would sell copies for a single copper cent, began to weave a tapestry of suspicion. They did not look toward the mundane dangers of an industrial city, the open cisterns, the dangerous drainage canals, or the heavy machinery of the rail yards. Instead, they pointed toward the exotic unknown. The whispers in the alleys spoke of nomadic caravans, of the so-called Romany travelers who camped in the vacant lots along the Des Plaines River. This was a trope as old as the city itself, a convenient phantom to blame for the unthinkable. The media began to draw terrifying parallels to a case from 4 years earlier, when a young girl named Lillian Wolfe had been found living among a nomadic group. That memory, fresh and stinging, provided the spark that ignited a city-wide fire of hysteria. A young boy named John Jarowski provided the first tangible thread for this narrative. He claimed to have seen a brightly colored wagon on Kedzie Avenue, just a block away from where Elsie was last seen. In his telling, 2 women sat atop the wagon, and one of them held a small child whose face was obscured by a heavy shawl. This single sighting, unverified and fleeting, became the foundation for a massive police mobilization. When investigators reached the camps near the river, they were told that one particular wagon had decamped and vanished on the morning of April 9th, the very day after Elsie disappeared. The coincidence was enough to seal the fate of the nomadic communities in the eyes of the public. To the fearful residents, the wood smoke from the travelers' fires was no longer a sign of a wandering life, but a signal of a predatory presence lurking at the edge of civilization. The search expanded with a desperate, frantic energy. Frank Paroubek, a man of modest means and broken heart, joined forces with detectives Sheehan and Comaris. They chased ghosts across the Illinois countryside, traveling 50 miles northwest to the village of Round Lake and further still to Cherry Valley. Frank, who could not read the English-language letters that now flooded his home, stood on the edges of these camps, peering into the faces of children who were not his own. He offered his life savings of $50, a small fortune for a laborer in 1911, as a reward. This gesture of fatherly devotion was soon bolstered by the powerful and the wealthy. The mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois added their own contributions, until the reward surpassed $4,000. The hunt was no longer a quiet investigation. It was a high-stakes pursuit that spanned 3 states, involving law enforcement from Wisconsin and Minnesota. In the rural outskirts, the hysteria took on an even more aggressive form. Farmers, hearing the news through the crackling reports of the day, began to arm themselves. They didn't wait for the police to arrive. They conducted their own unauthorized searches, confronting any traveler who dared to pass through their lands. There were reports of a child seen in a wagon near the village of Volo, described as looking disoriented and out of place. Each of these tips led to a surge of adrenaline followed by the cold, hollow ache of a dead end. Back in the city, the superintendent of schools, Ella Flagg Young, took the unprecedented step of asking 200,000 schoolchildren to search their own neighborhoods during their spring break. Imagine the scene. Thousands of small eyes peering into basement windows and under porch steps, looking for a flash of a red dress that was nowhere to be found. As the days stretched into weeks, the cultural divide in Chicago deepened. The Czech community, tight-knit and protective, rallied around the Paroubeks, while the broader public looked with mounting distrust at anyone who didn't fit the mold of a settled citizen. Anonymous letters began to arrive at the Paroubek home, written in English and filled with cruel accusations. These letters claimed that Elsie had been taken by someone who harbored a grudge against the family, yet the police continued to focus their resources on the nomadic camps. They searched 25 separate encampments, overturning beds and questioning families who had no connection to the missing girl. The air in the city felt heavy, charged with the static of 1,000 false leads, and the growing realization that the girl in the red dress was drifting further and further away into the fog of the unknown. The mid-April wind in 1911 did not carry the warmth of spring to the doorstep of the Paroubek home. Instead, it brought a biting chill that seemed to rattle the very bones of Chicago. As the days since Elsie's disappearance bled into weeks, the city transformed into a landscape of suspicion and shadows. The initial search of the neighborhood had yielded nothing but empty alleyways and the hollow echoes of the little girl's name. It was then that the gaze of the authorities and the public alike turned toward the outskirts of the city, where the smoke of nomadic campfires rose against the gray horizon. A theory had taken root, fueled by old fears and a recent history of similar tragedies. The belief that Elsie had been spirited away by one of the many wandering bands that moved through the Illinois countryside. This suspicion was not merely a whisper, it became a directive. Captain John Mahoney of the Hinman Street station watched as the investigation swelled, moving beyond the paved streets and into the mud-clogged trails of the rural counties. The search parties began their raids with a desperate intensity. The police focused their attention on the Des Plaines River, where several encampments had been spotted near Kedzie Avenue. Imagine the scene as the sun dipped below the trees. A line of heavy-booted officers and plainclothes detectives, their lanterns flickering like low-hanging stars, approaching the canvas tents and wooden wagons. There was a rhythmic, haunting sound to these nights, the jingle of horse harnesses, the crackle of damp wood in the fires, and the sharp, sudden commands of men in uniform. They searched every wagon, overturning blankets and peering into the smallest of crates, searching for a flash of golden hair or the whimpering of a 5-year-old child. By the time May 7th approached, more than 25 separate bands had been intercepted and searched. Each time the officers approached a new camp, there was a surge of adrenaline, a flickering hope that this would be the moment the nightmare ended. But each search ended the same way, with frustrated sighs, empty hands, and the weary realization that the trail remained cold. The search did not stop at the city limits. It expanded with a frantic energy, leaping from Illinois into the rolling hills of Wisconsin and even stretching toward Minnesota. Frank Paroubek, a man who had already given so much of himself to his work as a painter, refused to remain behind. He accompanied detectives Comaris and Sheehan on a long, arduous journey toward Round Lake. The travel was exhausting, conducted by buggy and by train, moving through a landscape that seemed indifferent to his grief. In the small town of Volo, approximately 43 miles from the city, rumors began to swirl that a girl matching Elsie's description had been seen. The reports were chilling. Locals claimed the child appeared stupefied, perhaps drugged, and was kept hidden beneath a heavy wool blanket within a traveling wagon. When the news reached the search party, they pushed their horses to the brink of collapse to reach the camp. But as they descended upon the site in McHenry, the tension snapped. The child they found was indeed fair-skinned, but she was not Elsie. She was a member of the nomadic group, and the lead dissolved into nothing more than the dust of the road. Back in Chicago, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of poison. Frank began to receive a series of anonymous, insulting letters. Because he could not read English, he had to sit in painful silence while neighbors translated the cruel words for him. The letters claimed that Elsie had been taken by someone who harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Paroubeks, accusing the family of mistreating her, a claim that was as baseless as it was heart-wrenching. Frank, in a fit of righteous fury and overwhelming sorrow, burned the letters, but their words lingered like soot in the air of their home. To add to the family's burden, their life savings were dwindling. Frank had offered $50 as a reward, a massive sum for a laborer in 1911, representing nearly everything they had. The financial strain was only matched by the physical toll. Frank was often seen wandering the streets late into the night, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken from a lack of sleep. He was a father being hollowed out by the very effort of holding onto hope. The police themselves were reaching a state of collapse. Inspector Healy and Lieutenant Costello were being swamped with tips from across the country. One letter arrived from a doctor in Arkansas, claiming to have seen a large group of children who did not look like they belonged to the traveling band they were with. Every such tip required coordination, telegrams, and the dispatching of men who were already spread too thin. The sheer scale of the manhunt was unprecedented for the time. In the towns of Sycamore and Cherry Valley, local chiefs joined the search, scouring the woods and the riverbanks until their feet were blistered and their voices were hoarse from shouting. The public, too, had become a frantic extension of the law. Farmers in rural Illinois began stopping every wagon they encountered, their suspicion turning into a form of vigilante oversight. The nomadic groups, feeling the mounting pressure and hostility, began to break camp in the middle of the night, moving further away and creating a game of cat and mouse that only served to further exhaust the searchers. As April transitioned into May, the focus of the investigation began to shift, though the encampments remained a focal point of public obsession. The authorities were caught between the pressure to follow every lead regarding the wandering bands and a growing, grimmer suspicion closer to home. Captain Mahoney, standing by the banks of the drainage canals that sliced through the city, began to order his men to drag the waters once again. The sensory experience of this phase was one of dampness and decay. The smell of the canal water, thick and stagnant, hung over the search parties as they used heavy iron hooks to scrape the bottom. Each time the hooks caught on something beneath the surface, the world seemed to stop spinning for the Paroubek family. They lived in a state of suspended animation, caught between the fear of finding her in the dark water and the agony of not finding her at all. The search of the camps had yielded 25 dead ends, and the exhaustion of the city was reaching its zenith. By the first week of May, the grand narrative of the kidnapping was starting to fray at the edges. The detectives who had traveled hundreds of miles across 3 states returned to Chicago with sunken eyes and empty notebooks. The desperation of the Paroubeks was no longer just a private tragedy. It was a public weight. Carolina Paroubek, staying at home and waiting for news that never seemed to come, found herself surrounded by a community that was as tired as she was. The search parties, once thousands strong, began to thin as the realization dawned that Elsie might never be found alive. The nomadic bands had mostly moved on, driven away by the constant raids and the glare of the spotlight. What remained was a silence that felt heavy and permanent. The search of the encampments had been a whirlwind of movement and noise, but as the dust settled, the mystery of Elsie Paroubek remained as dark and impenetrable as the deep, slow-moving waters of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. where the next chapter of this tragedy was waiting to be written. By the middle of May 1911, the city of Chicago had become a labyrinth of shared anxiety. What had begun as a neighborhood's frantic search for a little girl in a blue dress had evolved into a collective, citywide obsession that gripped every heart from the Gold Coast to the industrial West Side. The atmosphere in the streets was thick with a heavy, unshakable mourning, even though no body had yet been found. It was the mourning of innocence lost, a quiet realization that the sprawling, bustling metropolis could swallow a child whole without leaving a single trace. 2,000 police officers were now assigned to the case, a number that was unheard of for a single disappearance. The newspapers described it as the largest search in the history of the city, a relentless, churning machine of investigation that ground through every alleyway, every basement, and every vacant lot from the lakefront to the western prairies. The city was no longer just a place of commerce and noise. It was a sanctuary under siege, waiting for a sign that never seemed to come. The psychological impact on the families of Chicago was profound and immediate. Mothers who had once allowed their children to play freely in the sandlots and parks now kept them behind heavy, locked doors. The sound of children's laughter, which usually filled the warm spring air, was replaced by a somber silence that echoed through the cobblestone streets. Every stranger was a suspect. Every wagon passing down the lane was viewed with narrowed, distrustful eyes. There was a particular, sharp fear directed toward the roaming camps on the outskirts of the city, fueled by the persistent and dark rumors that Elsie had been spirited away by travelers. Even the schools felt the weight of the girl's absence. Superintendent Ella Flagg Young made an unprecedented appeal, asking 200,000 schoolchildren to spend their afternoons looking into yards and open spaces. It was as if the entire childhood population of Chicago had been enlisted as a silent army of watchers, their young eyes scanning the shadows for a glimpse of a familiar face that remained stubbornly hidden from view. Everywhere one looked, the face of Elsie Paroubek stared back from telegraph poles and brick walls. The reward posters were printed in bold, black ink, the kind that smudges on your fingers if you touch it too soon. They offered sums that grew larger by the day as the public's desperation mounted. Frank Paroubek had offered his life savings of $50, a humble amount that represented years of hard labor, while Judge Sabath added another $100 to the fund. In 1911, such sums were a fortune to a family living in a small flat on Albany Avenue. The Chicago Tribune and other private donors eventually pushed the reward even higher, and people would stand in the flickering glow of the gaslights, squinting at the grainy photograph of the girl with the soft eyes. The air felt charged with a quiet, desperate energy, as if the entire population was holding its breath. The posters began to peel at the edges, the paper yellowing in the sun and dampening in the rain, yet the face remained, a constant reminder of the void that had opened up in the middle of the city. Into the small, humble home of the Paroubeks, a different kind of storm was brewing. It came in the form of paper. Thousands upon thousands of letters began to arrive, delivered in heavy mail bags that the postman dragged to the door with a weary sigh. There were letters from Omaha, from Little Rock, and from tiny hamlets in the deep South. Some were written in the elegant, looping script of the highly educated, offering prayers and condolences to the grieving mother. Others were scrawled in pencil on scraps of butcher paper, claiming to have seen a girl matching Elsie's description boarding a train in the middle of the night or riding in the back of a covered wagon. There were ransom notes, 2 cruel, heartless demands for $500 that the family did not have, written by opportunists who sought to profit from a tragedy. Most painful of all were the anonymous, insulting letters written in English, which Frank could not read. When neighbors translated them, he found himself accused of mistreating his own daughter. In a fit of rage and grief, he burned those letters, trying to smoke out the malice that had invaded his home. Among the legitimate tips and the cruel hoaxes, there was a third category of correspondence, the messages from the seers and the mystics. In the early 20th century, the veil between the living and the dead was often felt to be thin, and dozens of self-proclaimed psychics reached out to the police with their visions. They spoke of crystal balls and voices from the beyond. One seer insisted that Elsie was being held in a place called Argo, Wisconsin, prompting officers to rush across state lines to search a town that seemed to exist only in the psychic's imagination. The search jumped from Illinois to Wisconsin and then to Minnesota, chasing ghosts and shadows. While the rational minds of the investigators tried to dismiss these claims, the sheer volume of the noise was impossible to ignore. It added to the sense that the city was no longer operating on logic, but was instead wandering through a mist of superstition and grief. Every tip, no matter how outlandish, had to be followed to its dead end, draining the resources of a police force that was already running on nothing but black coffee and frayed nerves. As the days stretched into the latter half of May, the initial frantic energy of the search began to settle into a deep, hollow ache. The great manhunt continued, but the hope that had fueled it was beginning to thin out like smoke in a winter wind. The detectives began to turn their eyes away from the distant camps and the train stations, looking instead toward the dark, slow-moving waters of the Chicago Drainage Canal. The city remained in a state of suspended mourning, a collective pulse of sorrow that beat in time with the ticking clocks in every parlor. The mystery of the girl in the blue dress had become a part of the city's very bones, a story that everyone knew but no one could finish. The streets were quieter now, the rewards remained unclaimed, and the letters continued to pile up in the corners of the Paroubek's living room, silent witnesses to a tragedy that was moving toward its final, devastating chord. We can almost hear the soft rustle of those thousands of pages, the ink of a nation's concern fading as the reality of the situation began to set in, heavy and cold as the river itself. Tea for the little girl with the golden hair had touched every corner of the state, but it was not until the morning of May 9th, 1911, that the search reached its silent, terrible conclusion. Far from the bustling, anxious streets of the city, approximately 35 miles to the southwest, lay the industrial landscape of Lockport. Here, the water moved with a slow, deliberate gravity, channeled between high limestone walls and massive iron gates. It was a place of engineering and cold functionality, where the roar of the powerhouse served as a constant, low-frequency hum against the silence of the surrounding fields. The canal was a vast, man-made artery, intended to carry away the waste of a growing metropolis. But on this particular morning, it held a secret that would bring a city to its knees. George Scully, an electrical engineer at the Lockport power plant, was accustomed to the various debris that the current brought to his gates. Often, it was timber, or perhaps a stray animal from one of the many farms that dotted the Illinois countryside. When he first looked out over the murky surface of the water, he saw a small, dark shape bobbing rhythmically against the concrete. To his tired eyes, it looked like nothing more than a lost sheep or perhaps a drowned pig, cast off from a nearby pasture. He watched it with a detached curiosity, noting how the water swirled around the object, but he did not move to investigate immediately. There was work to be done, and the canal was known for its grim surprises. For 3 long hours, the figure remained there, trapped in a slow eddy near the powerhouse. As the sun climbed higher, burning through the morning fog, the light began to play across the surface of the water, revealing details that George could no longer ignore. The shape was too deliberate, the colors too distinct. A sense of unease began to settle over the workmen as they gathered at the edge of the channel. The realization dawned slowly, a cold shiver passing from man to man. This was no animal. It was the small, fragile form of a child. The bustling activity of the power plant fell into a respectful, terrified hush. They knew the stories that had been filling the newspapers for weeks, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down upon them like the very stones of the canal. A small boat was launched into the dark, churning water of the canal. The rowers moved with a somber precision, their oars cutting through the surface with a muffled splash. When they finally reached the figure, the retrieval was handled with a tenderness that defied the industrial setting. They lifted the small form from its watery resting place, the water dripping from the fabric like tears. It was a scene of profound sorrow, the vastness of the canal dwarfing the tiny body they now held. As they rowed back to the shore, the only sound was the creak of the wood and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the machinery, a heartbeat for a place that felt suddenly hollow. The body was taken to the Goodale Memorial Chapel in Lockport, where the local undertaker, William Goodale, began the grim task of preparation. He noted the details with a clinical but compassionate eye. The child wore a dark red dress, the fabric heavy and sodden, but still retaining the hue of a garment chosen with care. Her stockings were black, their texture matching the descriptions that had been circulated by the police for over a month. Most striking of all was the hair, a pale, golden blonde that even the silt of the canal could not entirely dim. There was no hat, no trinkets, just the quiet evidence of a life that had been drifting in the darkness for far too long. Goodale knew immediately that the search for Elsie Paroubek was likely over. The news traveled back to the city with the speed of a physical blow, shattering the fragile peace of the Paroubek household. At midnight, Frank Paroubek was summoned and taken on a long, agonizing journey through the darkness to the village of Lockport. The night air was cool and heavy with the scent of coming rain, and the world outside the windows of the carriage was a blur of shifting shadows. When he arrived at the funeral home, the flickering light of the lamps cast long, dancing shapes across the wooden walls. He was led into the quiet room, where the air smelled of damp earth and stagnant water. He stood over the small form, his hands trembling as he reached out, though he did not touch. He looked at the clothes, the red dress he had seen so many times, the familiar texture of the stockings, and felt the crushing weight of reality. "The clothes look like Elsie's," he whispered, his voice cracking under the impossible strain of a father's grief. "But the face, I cannot recognize it. Her mother alone can tell." It was a moment of absolute, heart-trenching finality, as the small flame of hope that had sustained him for weeks finally flickered and went out, leaving only the cold, hard truth of the canal behind. The morgue in Joliet was a place where the air seemed to hold its breath. It was known among the locals as a quiet room, a final station where the noise of the bustling Chicago streets and the churning of the industrial canal finally fell away into a heavy, medicinal silence. On that morning in May of 1911, the sunlight struggled to penetrate the high, soot-stained windows, casting long, pale fingers across the stone floor. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of river silt and the sharp, biting tang of formaldehyde. In the center of this stillness lay the small form that had mobilized thousands of searchers across 3 states. After 33 days of frantic hope and dark rumors, the mystery had been reduced to the confines of a single, chilled chamber. The walls, painted a dull, clinical gray, seemed to lean inward, as if they too were waiting for the child to speak the secrets of her disappearance. Dr. Joseph Springer, the coroner's physician, was a man who lived in the company of the silent. He moved with a practiced, somber efficiency, his footsteps echoing softly against the tile. He was a man of science in an era where the lines between forensic fact and intuition were often blurred. As he approached the table, the flickering light of a gas lamp overhead caught the gold of his spectacles. He was joined by other medical men, including Doctors Paddock and Kingston, all of whom understood the weight of the task before them. This was not merely an examination of a tragic accident, it was an interrogation of the flesh. The city was crying out for an answer, demanding to know if the little girl had simply fallen into the treacherous currents of the canal, or if a more predatory shadow had snatched her away. Springer took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and began the work. The child was still dressed in the clothes she had worn on that breezy April afternoon when she first vanished. The investigators looked closely at the details that Elsie Paroubek had described so vividly to the police. There was the red dress, its once bright tint now dulled by the murky waters of the drainage canal. The texture of the stockings, though caked with fine silt, remained recognizable. Her hair, a soft shade of brown, was tangled with bits of river debris, yet it still held the ghost of the curls her mother had brushed so carefully. Initially, the reports from the scene had suggested there were no marks of violence, a detail that offered a small, cold comfort to the grieving family. But as Springer worked, his hands steady and his eyes keen, he began to see what the casual observer had missed. He noted the way the fabric of her collar sat against her skin and the faint, haunting discolorations. The most critical moment of the autopsy came when the doctors looked for the evidence of the river itself. In a typical case of drowning, the lungs would tell a specific story. They would be heavy, filled with the very fluid that had claimed the life. But as Dr. Springer and his colleagues performed their internal examination, they were met with a startling and chilling discovery. There was no water in Elsie's lungs. The organ was clear of the canal's brackish infusion. This single fact changed everything. It suggested that the little girl had not been breathing when she entered the water. She had not struggled against the current. She had not gasped for air beneath the surface. The realization hung in the air like a physical weight. If she had not drowned, then the river was not her killer, but merely a hiding place. The canal had been a shroud, not a weapon, and the timeline shifted into dark territory. Confusion soon rippled through the medical team, leading to conflicting reports that would haunt the case for decades. While some early whispers to the police suggested a simple accident, Springer's findings pointed toward something far more sinister. He observed deep, blue-tinged marks around the throat, suggesting she had been choked. Yet, as the examination progressed, a second theory emerged: suffocation. The physicians began to believe that a hand had been pressed firmly over the child's mouth and nose, perhaps to silence a cry for help. This was a death of terrifying intimacy, a calculated act of violence rather than a moment of environmental misfortune. There were also signs that she had been mistreated before her death, a euphemism used by the doctors of the time to describe an assault that made the tragedy even more unbearable. The quiet room was now filled with the unspoken horror of what Elsie had endured in the weeks she was missing. Despite the rigorous efforts of Dr. Springer and the other physicians, the quiet room could not provide the name of the monster. The autopsy had stripped away the theory of a tragic accident, replacing it with the certainty of a homicide, yet the evidence remained frustratingly thin. There were no fingerprints, no stray fibers from a captor's coat, nothing but the silent testimony of a 5-year-old girl who had been discarded like refuse in a drainage ditch. When the doors to the morgue finally swung shut and the doctors stepped out into the evening air, they carried with them the heavy burden of an unsolved mystery. The cause of death would be officially recorded by some as unknown, while others would forever insist on the reality of the suffocation they had witnessed on the slab. The quiet room fell into darkness once more, leaving the memory of Elsie Paroubek to drift back into the heart of a city that was now afraid. The morning of May 12, 1911, dawned with a heavy, humid stillness that seemed to press down upon the city of Chicago. It was a Friday, a day when the gears of industry usually ground with a relentless rhythm, but in the neighborhood of South Albany Avenue, the usual cacophony of commerce had been replaced by a low, vibrating murmur of human sorrow. Outside the modest home at 2320 South Albany, the air was thick with the scent of spring rain and something far more delicate: the perfume of thousands upon thousands of flowers. This was the day Chicago would say goodbye to little Elsie Paroubek. For weeks, the city had been gripped by the mystery of her disappearance, their hearts tethered to the hope of her safe return. Now that hope had curdled into a collective, crushing grief that demanded a witness. The Paroubek family, simple folk who lived a quiet life of labor, found themselves at the center of a historical tide they never could have imagined. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the streets surrounding the home were already impassable. It wasn't just the neighbors or the local bohemian community who came to stand vigil. People had traveled from every corner of the city, arriving by trolley car, by horse-drawn carriage, and on foot. Historians would later estimate that nearly 30,000 people converged upon those few city blocks. It was a sea of humanity that defied the capacity of any building. No church or hall in the district could begin to hold the magnitude of this morning. Because of this, the service was moved outside, onto the small patch of green that served as the Paroubek's front lawn. From above, looking down from the nearby tenement balconies and the rooftops of laundry-hung houses, the crowd looked like a dark, shifting carpet of black coats and veiled hats, all centered around one tiny, shimmering point of white. That point of white was Elsie's casket. It rested upon two polished brass stands, catching the filtered morning light. It was small, heartbreakingly so, and it was almost entirely obscured by a mountain of floral tributes. Mayor Harrison had sent vast sprays of roses, their petals a soft, bruised pink against the pale wood of the coffin. Judge Sabath and other city officials had sent towering arrangements of lilies and carnations, their white heads nodding in the slight breeze. The fragrance was overwhelming, a cloying, sweet weight that masked the smell of the nearby drainage canal and the soot of the city. To manage the sheer volume of flowers, friends of the family had placed a long wooden board across two chairs, creating a temporary altar to hold the hundreds of bouquets sent by strangers who had never met the child, but who felt as though they had lost a daughter of their own. The service itself was not a traditional religious affair. The Paroubeks were free thinkers, and so the ceremony was led by Rudolf Jaromir Senka, the esteemed editor of a local Bohemian newspaper. He stood near the casket, his voice carrying over the heads of the thousands who strained to hear. He spoke of innocence lost and the duty of a city to protect its most vulnerable. Beside him, Karolina Paroubek sat in a chair at the head of the coffin, her face a mask of exhaustion and despair. She had spent weeks wandering the streets, calling for her child, and now she sat in a terrifying silence. Frank stood beside her, his hands calloused from years of labor, now gripping the back of her chair as if it were the only thing keeping him upright in the storm. When the time came for the pallbearers to lift the small weight of the casket, a collective sob rippled through the crowd, a sound like a Great Lake wave breaking against the shore. Then began the procession, a spectacle of mourning that Chicago would not soon forget. At the head was a white hearse, pulled by two majestic white horses whose hooves clattered with a rhythmic, hollow sound against the cobblestones. Behind the hearse walked 8 little girls, all dressed in pure white dresses with ribbons in their hair. Among them were Elsie's playmates, Mary and Josie Trampota, their faces solemn and scrubbed clean. They carried massive sprays of lilies, their small arms barely able to wrap around the blooms. As the horses began their slow, measured walk toward the Bohemian National Cemetery, the 30,000 mourners began to move as one. It was a slow-motion river of grief, stretching for miles. Business in that part of the city simply stopped. Streetcars were halted, their drivers removing their caps in respect. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways, their aprons still on, watching the white hearse pass by in a silence so profound you could hear the creaking of the carriage wheels. The journey to the cemetery was long, a slow crawl through the heart of a community that felt violated by the crime. Every porch was filled with people. Every window had a face pressed against the glass. Strangers reached out to touch the side of the hearse as it passed, a desperate gesture of connection to a tragedy that had become universal. The air remained heavy, the sky a dull, aching gray that threatened rain but never quite broke. The rhythmic clip-clop of the horses was the only metronome for the city's heartbeat that afternoon. As the procession reached the gates of the Bohemian National Cemetery, the sheer scale of the gathering became even more apparent. Thousands had already arrived ahead of the carriage, waiting among the headstones to welcome Elsie to her final resting place. They stood among the monuments of their ancestors, a living wall of witnesses to a life that had only lasted 5 short years. At the graveside, the flowers were laid out in a circle, creating a vibrant ring of color against the dark, freshly turned earth. Senka spoke once more, his words a plea for justice that echoed off the stone mausoleums. He looked out at the faces, the laborers with their caps in hand, the mothers clutching their own children tightly, the officials in their fine suits. He told them that Elsie was no longer just a name in a newspaper. She was the conscience of Chicago. As the casket was lowered, Carolina had to be held back by her relatives, her voice finally breaking the silence with a cry that would haunt the memories of those present for decades. The crowd lingered long after the last shovelful of earth was placed. They left their flowers until the grave was a mound of roses and lilies, a mountain of beauty built upon a foundation of mystery. The city had stopped for Elsie Paroubek, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Chicago felt smaller, quieter, and infinitely more fragile. After the 2,500 mourners left the iron gates of the Bohemian National Cemetery, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the South Albany Avenue neighborhood. The flowers on the fresh grave began to wilt, their bright petals turning brittle and brown in the late spring air. For the Chicago police, the work was only just beginning, or perhaps it was already reaching a frustrating, stagnant end. The investigators, led by Captain Mahoney and Inspector Healy, felt the weight of the city's eyes upon them. They had found the child, they had comforted the family, but they had no hands to cuff. The shadows of the investigation stretched long across the uneven cobblestone streets, reaching into the darkest corners of the city, where the eccentric and the marginalized lived. Every night, the lamps flickered as if reflecting the uncertainty of justice. There was one name that whispered through the precinct halls with a particular, desperate urgency: Joseph Consti. To many in the area, he was known simply as a hermit, a bearded man who lived in a ramshackle hut near the drainage canal at West 33rd Street and South Kedzie Avenue. His home was little more than a collection of salvaged wood and rusted tin, sitting barely a mile and a half from the Paroubek house. His landlady, a woman named Mrs. David Shaughnessy, had grown increasingly suspicious of his behavior. She told the authorities that Consti had a troubling habit of bringing children around his shack. On the 9th of May, the very day Elsie's body was recovered, she had finally evicted him. The coincidence was far too sharp for the detectives to ignore, and they turned their full attention toward his door. The pressure on Consti became an unbearable weight as the detectives closed in. On the 10th of May, just one day after Elsie was found and 2 days before her funeral, the man chose a violent, final escape. He threw himself in front of a moving train, his life ending in a flurry of iron and steam. For a brief moment, the police believed they had their man, a culprit who had taken his dark secrets to the grave. They searched his shack with meticulous care, sifting through the meager belongings of a lonely man, looking for a scrap of red fabric or a lock of blonde hair. But they found nothing. Within 5 days, the investigators were forced to admit that there was no evidence linking the hermit to the crime. He was cleared in death, leaving the police back in the cold light of uncertainty. The search for a villain then turned back toward the outskirts of the city, where the Roma people had pitched their colorful wagons. The prejudice of the era was a thick fog, and the police were quick to blame those they did not understand. They questioned Joseph Mitchell and searched through 25 different camps, looking for any sign of a child who did not belong. They followed a runaway wagon all the way to Round Lake, 50 miles northwest of Chicago, but every lead evaporated like mist. Frank Paroubek himself joined these searches, his heart a raw and bleeding wound, but he returned with empty hands. He even told police about a mysterious stranger he met on the street who claimed to have seen Elsie on Kedzie Avenue. But that man, too, vanished into the city's crowded thoroughfares, never to be heard from again. As the months turned into years, the vibrant life that once filled the Paroubek home began to drain away. Frank Paroubek, a man who had worked as a painter and built a life for his 7 children, could not recover from the loss of his youngest. The grief was a physical ailment, a slow-acting poison that clouded his eyes and slowed his step. On the 12th of May, 1913, exactly 2 years to the day after his daughter's funeral, Frank passed away. He was only 45 years old. It was as if his heart simply gave up, unable to beat in a world where his little girl's laughter had been permanently silenced. He was laid to rest in the same soil as Elsie, finally finding the peace that had eluded him since that fateful April morning when the sun was high and warm. Karolina Paroubek lived on for many more years, a widow draped in the quiet, heavy dignity of her sorrow. She watched the world change around her, but her heart remained anchored in 1911. She passed away on December 9, 1927, and was buried alongside her husband and daughter. The case of Elsie Paroubek was never officially closed with a conviction. No one was ever brought to justice for the blue marks on her throat or the cold water of the canal. The investigation became a collection of yellowed papers and forgotten tips, a ghost story whispered in the halls of the Maxwell Street station. The city moved on, the canal continued to flow, and the shadows finally claimed the secret of what happened to the girl in the red dress. Sleep now, for the mystery remains. The city of Chicago is a landscape of constant rebirth, a place where steel and glass rise over the ghosts of the past. The cobblestones that once felt the heavy wheels of horse-drawn wagons are now buried deep beneath layers of modern asphalt, and the echoes of 1911 have long since softened into a low, distant hum. But some stories do not simply wash away with the rain or fade with the turning of the calendar. The disappearance of Elsie Paroubek is one such story. It is a narrative that drifted out of the police blotters and into the realm of legend, a haunting melody that found its way into the most unexpected of places. For over 100 years, the question of what truly happened during those final days in the spring has remained unanswered, lingering like the mist over the drainage canal, where her journey finally came to an end. It is a case that rests not because it was solved, but because the world eventually ran out of whispers. In a small, narrow room at 851 West Webster Avenue, a man named Henry Darger lived a life of profound and total invisibility. To his neighbors, he was simply a reclusive janitor, a man who attended Mass several times a day and spent his evenings in solitude, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and jars of murky glue. He was a shadow in the hallway, a man who spoke more to himself than to the world outside. It was only after his death in 1973 that the heavy trunks in his room were opened, revealing a secret universe of staggering scale. Inside were over 15,000 handwritten pages and massive, colorful scrolls of art that depicted an epic war between innocence and cruelty. This was the realms of the unreal, and at the very center of this masterpiece was a child whose face Darger had never forgotten. Her name in his world was Annie Ehrenberg, but her soul belonged to Elsie. Darger had been 19 years old when Elsie vanished. He had clipped a photograph of the 5-year-old girl from the May 9th edition of the Chicago Daily News, a grainy image that captured her light hair and her steady, curious gaze. For reasons known only to his own lonely heart, that clipping became his most precious possession. He treated it like a sacred relic, a symbol of everything beautiful and fragile in a world he found increasingly harsh. When that photograph was later stolen from his locker or lost in the clutter of his life, Darger was plunged into a state of spiritual despair. He prayed for its return, and when it did not appear, he began to write. He recreated Elsie in his art, transforming her from a tragic headline into a martyred leader of a rebellion. In his imagination, She was no longer a lost child in a canal. She was a powerful, eternal force fighting against the darkness, a girl who could never truly be harmed again. The art Darger created was filled with the textures of his obsession. He used vivid watercolors, electric blues, deep crimsons, and soft, hazy yellows to bring his vision to life. The Vivian girls, the heroic sisters of his epic, moved through landscapes that felt both beautiful and terrifying. He would trace figures from advertisements and children's books, layering them into panoramic scenes of battle and peace. Through these scrolls, Elsie lived 1,000 lives. She became a pillar of strength for the forgotten children of the world. Even as the real case grew cold, and the detectives who walked the banks of the canal passed into history themselves, Elsie remained vibrant and alive on the walls of that cramped apartment on Webster Avenue. Darger gave her the one thing the real world could not: a story where her suffering had a purpose, and where her memory would be preserved in a kaleidoscope of color that would one day stun the world of art. But away from the vibrant scrolls and the fictional wars, the real mystery of the drainage canal remains as still as the water itself. We are left with the conflicting reports of the doctors in 1911, the arguments over whether she had drowned or been taken by a stranger. We think of the 35 miles she would have had to travel from her home to the power plant in Lockport, a journey that defies simple explanation. Was it a tragic accident on a construction-heavy street, or was there a figure in the shadows, a name never written in the ledgers of the law? The truth has settled into the silt at the bottom of the canal, unreachable and silent. The theories of traveling wagons and neighborhood borders have all dissolved, leaving behind only the image of a yellow dress and the sound of an organ grinder's melody fading into the distance of a warm April morning. The ambiguity is the final weight of the case, a heavy curtain that will never be drawn back. Elsie now rests in the Bohemian National Cemetery, reunited with her father, Frank, and her mother, Carolina. Their headstones stand as a quiet testament to a family that was shattered by a single day in spring, a family that carried their grief until their very last breaths. Visitors sometimes leave small tokens or flowers, remembering the little girl who once brought a whole city to a standstill. Her legacy is one of both sorrow and incredible inspiration, a reminder of how the smallest lives can leave the deepest impressions on the human soul. She is the lost child of Chicago, the girl who became a goddess in a janitor's secret books, and a symbol of the enduring mystery that lives in the heart of every great city. We may never know the path she walked during those final 6 weeks, but we know that she is no longer lost. She is part of the architecture of our memory, a soft light in the twilight of history. As we pull away from the banks of the canal and leave the dusty room of Henry Darger behind, the air grows still and cool. The sounds of the modern world begin to soften, and the heavy pages of the past are slowly closed. The colors of the watercolors fade into a gentle gray, and the weight of the unanswered questions begins to lift. There is a peace in the unknown, a quiet grace in letting go of the search for a truth that time has hidden away. The wind over the lake carries no more secrets tonight, only the soft rhythm of a world preparing for rest. We leave Elsie where she is at peace, surrounded by the family who loved her and the art that gave her wings. The night is long, and the shadows are kind. It is time to let the mind grow heavy and the heart find its rhythm in the silence of the room around you. The journey is over, and the path is clear. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.